You are listening to the
World Extreme Medicine.
The World Extreme Medicine
Podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. In this episode, we're going to be speaking about harnessing the healing properties of nature by chimpanzees in the wild with Elodie Freymann. So what we're going to do is really delve into one of the most fascinating aspects of primate behavior in recent years, and that's around chimpanzees using plants for self-medication. So recent discoveries have revealed that how intelligent these animals can be by selecting and using medicinal plants, sometimes in ways that overlap with traditional human medicine. So in this episode, we're going to explore how researchers in Uganda observed wild chimpanzees incorporating plants into their daily lives, offering insight into their self-healing practices. So we're also going to discuss the health conditions these chimpanzees face and how their responses to certain plants deepen our understanding of their relationship with the flora in their habitats. Elodie is a New York-born, London-based scientist. Elodie's research focuses on how wild chimpanzees self-medicate with medicinal plants, blending her expertise in primatology, botany, social anthropology, filmmaking, and conservation. So during her 9-month stay in Uganda's Budongo forest, she worked with 2 chimpanzee communities, tracking their behaviors, their daily habits, and studied their habitats as well. So she conducted ethnomedicinal interviews with traditional healers and collected plants for testing for Brandenburg University in Germany. Elodie, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
It's great to have you with us, actually. I wonder if we would just kick off, Elodie, by just asking just what recent discoveries scientists have made about chimpanzees using plants for self-medication.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think one of the exciting things about this particular field, which is called zoopharmacognosy, which literally translates to animals' use of pharmacological medicines, is that there's a lot of new material coming out. There's a lot of new data. There's a lot of new research that's showing that, surprisingly or unsurprisingly, a lot of animals throughout the animal kingdom, from birds to chimps to insects, they're self-medicating, and which is a very exciting kind of new discovery. And a lot of new research, especially in the great apes, has been coming out lately that's been showing that apes, obviously, they're very closely related to us. They're very smart. They're very kind of good and at navigating the flora and their landscape. So, again, surprisingly or unsurprisingly, it turns out that these great apes are searching for medicines in their forests. One of the recent discoveries that kind of broke the internet was an orangutan using a leaf of a kind of an herb in their landscape on a wound to heal it. But there's also been recent discoveries of chimpanzees using insects on their wounds to heal themselves, and also potentially applying those same insects to the wounds of others. So lots of new exciting information coming out in this field.
It's absolutely fascinating, actually. And like you say, to see it firsthand would be fascinating as well. Could you maybe speak to how researchers in Uganda sort of observed chimpanzees using medicinal plants in their daily lives? Was it sort of directly observational around certain times of day? Were they in situ with the chimpanzees? How did it play out?
Yeah, so this was actually part of my PhD research. So for this project, I was in the field in Uganda. And of course, it wasn't just me. Every chimpanzee field site is run and managed largely by local guides and local primatologists. And so it was very much a group effort. So we would go into the forest every day. I took, during my 2 different field seasons, I focused on 2 different chimp communities who are neighbors, so they live next to each other. But I took data on those chimps' behaviors, and particularly I was focusing on what foods they were eating, or applying to themselves, or any sort of interactions, unusual interactions that I saw the animals have with flora in their environment. And I wrote everything down. I filmed everything, so I had my camcorder on me at all times. And I wrote down also just sort of things that couldn't necessarily be coded, like what the weather was like, or if there were variables, if the chimps seemed agitated, if something seemed amiss, if the chimps traveled a really far distance. So I was kind of keeping an ethnography, conducting as you would anthropological research in a human community. I was doing that with the chimpanzees. And I was also taking GPS data. I was taking health data. So I basically had all of these different groups of evidence. And my job when I came back from the field was to kind of amalgamate them and find and triangulate them to try to find cases of sick or wounded individuals that were seeking out unusual plants. And then, of course, we did this pharmacological component too, which I'm happy to talk about later, where we actually tested those plants that they were using for their bioactive properties to see if actually what we had on our hands was, bioactive plants.
Which again is fascinating because like you said, it kind of unlocks some of these habitual practices, which addresses maybe pathology that we weren't even aware of, which is super interesting. Could you maybe speak to why, or indeed any patterns you saw for these chimpanzees consuming plants? I'm not going to, there's a couple of names, I'm not going to maul them actually, but could you maybe speak to, was it wound healing? Was it some digestive issues? Was it what kind of trends were you seeing through the data and indeed through your observations?
Yeah, another great question. So we basically, as context, kind of as background before I answer the question, a lot of the research in the past, historically on this topic, has been done specifically on internal parasites, so plants that might help reduce parasite infections in an individual. And mostly that's there's a methodological explanation for why that's been the focus. It's, relatively simple and non-invasive to collect feces samples of an individual, see what their parasite load is, and then you observe them eat something funny, you can collect another sample and you can see whether or not that parasite infection reduced. But for this project, we really wanted to have an open mind. We didn't want to focus just on parasitology. And in fact, the paper that came out of this, one of the papers that came out of this project, we talk about parasite infections, but our focus is on wounds and other sort of potentially bacterial infections. So that was kind of this methodological limitation that previously has been done. And the way that we combated that was we took a new type of health metric. We looked at urine samples as well. And so we were keeping track of whether or not they had, indicators in their urine that they had some sort of bacterial infection, if they were stressed, potentially hungry, if they had something going on with their immune system. So we were able to really cast a wider net. And what we found was, so in our paper, we were looking specifically at barks. We looked at some piths, which is, the kind of starchy, fibrous stems. And we looked at some leaves. And we found evidence or, cases in which individuals with wounds, so open wounds, injuries, were seeking out these unusual plants. And we also found several cases where chimps with apparent bacterial infections, showing indications of bacterial infections, were also seeking out these unusual plants. So it was, again, with our health metrics, with our urine, we're not able to necessarily say 100% this is the bacteria that they were fighting off. But what we can say is this individual wasn't healthy, and this individual was showing signs of, something is going on with them. They're not in tip-top shape. And a next kind of area of research that we want to explore is identifying what those specific pathogens were that they were trying to self-medicate for.
Could you speak to, because like you said, you did spend time in country. Could you speak to any alignment you saw with indigenous practice? Was there any sort of commonality of indigenous herbal medicinal properties, or indeed using the same kind of plants or trees or bark for pathology?
Yeah, and this is something that was very, instrumental in our methodology, and something that we cared a lot about exploring, because my background is in social anthropology. I got my start in ethnobotany. To me, it's sort of one of the most interesting things that you could look at is potential overlaps in the medicinal repertoires between people and non-humans that, share an ecosystem. So what we did was, after we had gathered this data on the chimpanzee behavior, and after we had, had a sense basically of what plants we wanted to focus in on, I went to a couple of villages and I sat down with some local healers there, and I had just some conversations, some chats with the healers, with them, about the traditional medicinal practices in the area and also which plants from the forest people were relying on. And I did this in a kind of semi-structured way. It was really more of a conversation. And in our paper that came out and in subsequent papers, I haven't necessarily published specifically the results of these interviews for, ethical reasons and just respecting the privacy of these traditional healers and their practices. But something I can say is that there was a ton of overlap, and the traditional healers were, all of them that I talked to without exception, were not surprised that the chimpanzees were using these plants as well. And I think that that's a really telling sign. We as scientists often come in and we hyper focus on certain components of a research study, and turns out that people living nearby, knew it the whole time. And that happens time and time again in this field and across, animal behavior studies. So the traditional healers that I talked to were not surprised that chimps were using these medicines, but there was a lot of overlap. And how the healers used these different plants, particularly barks. I focused a lot on barks in my research, the tree bark generally, which is not necessarily a nutritious resource, and it's time consuming to eat. It's energetically expensive to exploit. So why go after barks when there's a forest full of fruit? But what the traditional healers, what all of them said is that they're rich in medicinal properties, and they were used for a range of different, curing a range of different ailments and infections in local villages. So that was an exciting finding. One of the moments for me that I really convinced myself of this study.
So, Elodie, could you speak to just how you discern the difference, or indeed differentiate an animal or indeed a chimpanzee using a plant maybe one time versus a trend emerging versus actually this clear alignment with pathology? They're treating it really. There is a very intentionality for treating illness. Could you maybe speak to how you differentiate that?
Yeah, this is the golden ticket question. What makes something, how can we show something is intentional? And I think this is something that people in my field in zoopharmacognosy have struggled with for a very long time, because you obviously, in the ideal world, you could sit down with a chimpanzee, you could say, why are you eating this plant? But you can't. So you're working, I always think of it kind of like you're a detective and you're trying to find clues and evidence and piece it together. And you're never going to 100% have that, that piece of evidence or that moment where you're 100% sure. But what you can do is over time, you can gather enough evidence that you can make a case. And that's what intentionality, that's what showing intentionality is in this field. So what I did with my research and how we structured this study was basically, to find as much evidence of intentionality as possible. And one resource that we had that could help with that is we had access to a long-term data set from the field site where we were working in the Badongo forest. And so we have 30 years of data, feeding data about these chimpanzee communities, and we can look at how often, for example, they ate a certain tree. So I'll use the example of this tree, Alstonia boonei, which I use as the example because it was the eureka moment for me with the bark of this tree, because there were just so many pieces of evidence that were pointing to intentional self-medication. So for one, when you look at the long-term data, you could see that Alstonia boonei bark was eaten it was eaten a handful of times, but certainly it was a rare behavior. It was enough that we could look at things like seasonal trends, for example, but clearly it happened a couple times a year. So then we could look at, for example, whether or not the times in which Alstonia bark consumption, which periods of the year it peaks, and look at seasonal trends. And what we found was that, the Alstonia boonei bark peaks during a period in which respiratory infections also peak. And it doesn't peak during periods of time where food is scarce, for example. So it doesn't appear that they're eating this bark because they have nothing else to eat, which was the past hypothesis. Rather, it looks like they're eating this bark during periods of time where pathogens are increasing and they're more likely to be sick. That's one piece of evidence that, for example, it's not just opportunistic feeding. There's a pattern to it. then we could also look at where they were eating this bark. And I also had my own data from this, but also we could look at the long-term data, and we could see that they were traveling far distances in many cases to access the bark of Alstonia boonei. So it's not like they just are walking through the forest and they stumble across these trees and they decide to eat them then and there. It looks like they're actually going out of their way to locate these trees and eat the bark. So there's evidence like that come from data. And then there's also, again, this ethnographic approach, these anecdotes and these case studies of, chimpanzees, and we have it on video of a really sick chimpanzee who's having, showing he's had diarrhea for the last few days. He has a bad injury and he is seeking out bark, limping over to an Alstonia boonei tree and chewing just one small bite of the bark, which is incredibly bitter. And then you have that in addition to the fact that we've done pharmacological tests on this bark, and we find that it's incredibly antibacterial and has other bioactive properties. This is, you can begin to see all the different strands of evidence coming together to make this case of not only that these resources happen to be bioactive, but that the chimps know it and are seeking them out when they're, struggling with their health.
I mean, it's hugely fascinating from multiple angles, really. But I guess my next question would be, Elodie, how does this inform future medicinal practices? What else can we garner? And indeed, yeah, what does it point to for future discovery of medicinal properties of plants?
Well, I mean, I think that this field is so exciting. I've been studying it now for 5 years, pretty much every day of my life, and I'm still absolutely fascinated by it. I think it's a field with a ton of potential, a ton of possibilities, both for, as you mentioned, drug discovery and the implications for human medicine and responsibly discovering new medicines that could help us as a species, but also for keeping these, incentivizing keeping these habitats around and these ecosystems around long enough that we can actually begin to identify these new compounds that could be helpful. If the chimps disappear, we lose our teachers. If the forests disappear, we lose our medicines. And it's just this, we're sitting on this gold mine of potential cures that could help us out in a future pandemic or in a world in which antibiotic resistance is rapidly increasing. And instead, what we're choosing to do is cut these forests down. So yeah, there's huge potential for drug discovery, again, if it's done ethically and responsibly and local communities are, included and the wildlife is not harmed. But basically, there's just so much scientific research left to do, and we have to save these places before, they disappear, so that we can do that responsible research.
Could you dig into some of the challenges, Elodie, that you faced, just either, data in the data collection or the interpretation, or indeed trying to sort of triangulate and articulate the habits of the chimpanzees, or anywhere across the spectrum? Just give us a sense of the challenges you faced.
Oh, there's certainly challenges. I think, just in designing this study, it was challenging to get people on board. I mean, I had an amazing, community of colleagues and supportive supervisors that helped. And this was, as I said, a huge group effort that involved international collaborators. But it's when designing a study that relies on, seeing rare events, you're always going to be scared that you're going to get to the forest, you're going to get the grants, you're going to get the equipment, you're going to get the permits, and you're going to show up and you're not going to see anything. You're just going to see chimps being healthy, grooming each other, doing tons of other interesting things, but you're just not going to see that moment where they self-medicate. And that was, I think, mentally, challenging at first, of like just psyching myself out. Am I going to go and do this study and find nothing? And I just really stand by this opinion that when you're studying wild animals in the field, especially chimpanzees, which are such amazing animals, you're always going to see something incredible, and you're always going to see something relevant. And I think having an open mind going into the study for all of us involved was, really important. We didn't know what we were going to see. We didn't know what kind of plants we were going to see them eat. We didn't know what sicknesses they were going to have, but we took a lot of data. We cast a very wide net, and we collaborated with, local primatologists that were working in the field, that had been working with the chimps and in the forest for over 30 years, that knew everything about them. We worked with the traditional healers, as I said. So inclusivity and open-mindedness, I think, really, really helped us. And, another challenge was just conditions. We were working in the rainy season. We were working at times where it was sometimes, we got stung by poisonous caterpillars. There were venomous snakes. There was challenges on the day-to-day. And then Dr. Fabian Schultz in New Brandenburg, who led the pharmacological testing, I'm sure he had a lot of challenges also with the lab work, but he's an amazing scientist and an amazing colleague, and was able to, pull everything together with time restraints and financial restraints. And so it was an amazing feat. And we're very proud of all of the different people that were involved to make it happen.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal effort actually, and like you said, it relies on multiple moving parts, which is complex and difficult to manage. Could you speak to, you've mentioned something in your last answer actually, Elodie, about chimps' behavior and their cognition, and kind of trying to discern and unpick, right, is this an intentional move towards the bark, or what is their behavior like? And one of the things that comes through both in the paper and is well known is that is the really the sense of family, like you say, of grooming others. They're very almost matriarchal in their habits. They look after the family, and they very much care for one another. Did you see, I guess my question on the bottom of that is, did you see any medicinal practices where they were caring for others, sort of giving each other the bark, or rubbing these plants, these leaves on each other, or was it more sort of self-medication?
It's a great question. I actually, with some colleagues, have a paper hopefully coming out kind of soon about this. So without sort of giving too much away, I did find evidence of pro-social care in our field site. So, and this is not novel. It's been observed across several field sites at this point. I mean, I mentioned earlier this amazing insect study in Gabon, where a mother was seen applying insects to the wound of her offspring, and I think also between unrelated group members as well. And this pro-social care has been observed in wound healing contexts in several places, and we did find evidence of that in Badongo. And that was exciting, and of course there's really interesting cognitive implications of that. I think in our field we get so used to saying self-medication because that's how the field began, looking at behaviors that had to do with oneself. But I think we're going to soon have to start changing our terminology because it's clearly, ants are shown to pro-socially care for each other in certain contexts. This is not something that is unique to people, but we're still, again, at the cusp of understanding of that. And I think I err on the side of actually giving non-human animals the benefit of the doubt in these situations. We like to think of ourselves as incredibly unique in every single way, and we spend, years and years trying to find every piece of evidence to show that we're special, and that other animals aren't as smart as us, aren't as social as us, aren't as communicative as us. But in my opinion, it's way more interesting to flip that on its head, and instead of assuming that we're unique, assume that we have more in common than we think, and go looking for those similarities, and not to anthropomorphize those animals and say that they're like us, but to assume that they're capable of amazing things, because that's that open-mindedness that I think allows you to kind of think big in your hypotheses and look out for things and see things, observe things that otherwise people would assume aren't there. So I think cognitively, not just great apes, but many, many, many animals are capable of pro-social care as well as self-care. And I think we're going to learn more and more about that as time goes on.
Just a couple more questions, actually, Elodie. One would be around The use and or habitual practice of using multiple medications, so multiple plant sources, and something which maybe wasn't initially or indeed initially known or observed, but has been now. Could you speak to, I guess, in a way, using the whole forest as a medicinal resource, and knowing through received wisdom from other chimpanzees or otherwise, just the way that they resource the whole forest, and indeed multiple different medicinal properties from the forest?
Yeah, great question. I think, previously, historically, when people have studied chimpanzee self-medication, there's been, certain plants in mind. You have, a bitter plant that is known to be antibacterial or known to have bioactive properties. And you go into the study and you're looking for cases in which the chimp is eating that specific plant. But what we're seeing again more and more is that there's actually kind of no end to which plants could be part of the chimpanzee's medicine cabinet and part of their medicinal repertoires. And it can take many forms. It can be leaves, it can be piths, it can be bark, it can be fruits. And so, and that's just the kind of the flora, that's just the plants, but there's also evidence of clay or soil eating, which could be medicinal, potential insect use. So the whole forest, in my opinion, should be considered, suspect medicines for the chimps. And something that I explored also as part of my PhD project, which I find a really, interesting concept, is whether or not the chimps could be combining medicines, as you said, and taking advantage of synergistic effects that the plants are having when eaten in combination. So to look at this, I developed this hypothesis, which I wrote up in a paper that came out earlier this year, in which I kind of explore a method for how to look at this in long-term data sets. And I won't go into the, boring details, but basically it suggests these two methods for looking at chimpanzee diets, and you pull from those diets different combinations. And using those combinations, you could then do further pharmacological testing or, more behavioral research into whether or not those plants are actually either increasing the potency of one another or actually combining to have a new, a new pharmacological property or a new characteristic that's helping the animal self-medicate against a certain pathogen. And this wouldn't be unique in chimps. People do this across traditional knowledge systems in humans, where, it's very rare in traditional medicine, in my experience, that you just have one plant as a silver bullet. It's usually a combination, of herbs prepared in different ways, brewed together, taken in tea together. Our traditional knowledge, medicinal knowledge systems are full of these combinations. So why shouldn't the chimpanzees, also utilize medicinal combinations? And whether or not they have the cognitive capacity for that is kind of the question. But according, with what we know about chimpanzee cognition and how good they are at, planning their meals ahead of time and doing other sort of combinatorial behaviors, I don't think that it would be beyond the scope of what they're capable of. So that's also kind of a new subfield of zoopharmacognosy, or animal self-medication, that I think is a fascinating new area to explore.
So, Elodie, just finally, as we come into land, could I get you to speak to, we've just touched there on the ecosystem of, like I say, resourcing the whole jungle, and either the plants, the soil, the bark, the trees. Could I get you to speak to something around conservation, really, and just how important really it is to preserve the ecosystem, just to protect the plants, and but also, like you said, the secondary health of the animals, of the chimpanzees, and maybe just the importance of ecosystem of these primary rainforests.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, what it's all about, I think. There's no point in studying animal behavior if we can't keep those animals alive. There's no point in studying these ecosystems if we're going to just chop them down. We're studying them to better preserve them and better conserve them. And I think that's the driving force behind all of our studies. And at least my own personal motivation is keep the chimps healthy, keep the forests healthy and happy, and in doing so, you keep people happy. There's, of course, the local communities that are relying on the forest, but also us as a global population that are relying on those forests, and potentially for medicine down the road. So it's critical, and we're at a critical point, as everyone knows, with keeping forests alive. There's not to end on a downer, because I think there is a positive twist to this, but there's a ton of deforestation happening in the area where I worked. That being said, the positive twist, there's a lot of people that care about keeping these forests healthy that are fighting back. But chimps are disappearing, forests are disappearing, and it's now, critical now more than ever that we keep these wild places around. And I think it's more than just keeping the trees there as well. Climate change will have an impact on which trees are, going to be able to survive the next 50 years. And if we don't keep if we, don't get climate change under control, we could even if the forest is there, we could lose these medicinal resources. We could lose these non-human teachers, that we need to collaborate with in order to discover new medicines to keep us around for the future. So I think the takeaway of this is that it's a holistic system, and we have to see it as such. We can't just focus on keeping the chimps around, because if we focus all of our energy on just protecting the chimps, but their medicines disappear, they could be there physically, but they could have no line of defense against pathogens that otherwise they were able to self-medicate for using plants. So it's everything together. It's the plants, it's the chimps, it's the local communities, that we need to be focusing on. And that's another reason I really love this topic, is that it draws our attention to that we live in this interconnected world, in which flora, fauna, and people are relying on each other. And I think that's the message, the conservation message, that I would say this topic really alerts us to.
Yeah, that's powerful, Elodie. That's absolutely powerful. And I think you're right, that interconnected nature it's a lovely place to finish, because we are far more interconnected than would first be observed. So, but listen, thank you for the past 45 minutes. I really appreciate you just really making this accessible to both me and to the wider audience, because I think when you start to dig into your research thesis, and indeed into the research, it can become super complex and really intricate. So it's nice to have just be able to focus and indeed frame this in the wider context as well. So, but thank you for your time, Elodie. I think what we'll do is we'll put in the show notes, we'll put the links to your research so that people can go away and read them. But thank you again.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on whichever platform you're listening to. Please also head over to the World Extreme Medicine website, where you can find more engaging content on extreme medicine webinars, and indeed the collection of courses from our global network, including humanitarian, disaster relief, expedition, space, military, tactical, and performance medicine. Thanks again.